Hello and welcome to The Royals. I'm Roya and Kate, Royal Editor for The Sunday Times.
And I'm Kate Mancy, Royal Editor for The Times.
We're heading into 2026, but the Christmas news cycle has been anything but quiet for the monarchy. Just as the palace was surely hoping for a fresh start, a series of stories has brought new challenges.
The further release of the Epstein files in the US once again brought Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor back into focus. It raised questions about whether this was the most damning moment yet or simply the latest twist in a long-running story the palace no doubt wishes to leave behind.
So what are the biggest challenges ahead and what might be in store for the royals in 2026?
Well, for a start, nearly 2 years since the King's cancer diagnosis, his cancer treatment will be reduced. So, could the King beat his own record for public engagements again?
The King is also set to visit America following the success of President Trump's second state visit last year. So what could Charles's state visit mean not just for the monarchy, but for his relationship with Trump?
And to help us navigate what promises to be an eventful year ahead, we're pleased to be joined by the executive editor of The Times and Times Radio, Jeremy Griffin. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Roy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And last time we saw you on the podcast, it was very much the other way around, Jeremy. You were grilling us gently at the Cheltenham Literature Festival.
Yes.
Sautéing towards the end of last year. And it was a very heady time, actually, on the Royal Beat, because that was just days before the release of Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl. There was a lot going on. The sort of spotlight was again on Andrew. It was a kind of extraordinary end to the year for the royal family. What did you make of it?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It was a gentle grilling. It's sort of gas mark 2. I hope you're going to keep it around.
We're turning up to 3 today.
Yes, okay. I remember that conversation well at Cheltenham Town Hall in October at the Cheltenham Literature Festival in front of a very knowledgeable audience. And one of the reasons I remember it well is I think I'm right in saying a few days earlier, one of the Sunday newspapers had disproved a line that Andrew had given in his famous Newsnight interview about when he had last had contact with Jeffrey Epstein. And we were sitting there discussing this and whether or not we could, what would happen to Andrew over the course of the next few weeks and months, I think. And I remember us discussing whether there were any options left open to the King with regard to what he might do about Andrew's position. And there was some talk at the time, you'll remember, about whether he might lose his titles and how easy that would be, and letters patent and the procedure that would be involved in that. And I think we all felt, I certainly felt at the time that it might be that Charles wanted to do that, but actually he would find it very difficult to do so. That was how that conversation ended up. And then I got in my car the following day to drive home, and before I did, I checked the Times app, and the lead story in the Times app was Kate's story about the fact that the Duke was about to lose his titles. Well, the then Duke was about to lose his titles, the Duke of York, and that set off a chain reaction of stories that really lasted for the rest of the year. So it was an incredible acceleration. It felt to me in a story that it hadn't plateaued as such, but we hadn't had any major new developments for a while. And then all of a sudden, at the start of that week, a few days before we had that conversation, something happened, which was a catalyst that changed the shape of the royal family forever, I felt.
Well, if you think that's how 2025 ended, doesn't really feel like the end of that story, does it? I mean, what do you think? You're sort of hitting on a really interesting point, which was it had stalled, that story, but then all his titles were taken away. And it makes you wonder, what did they know? What did they fear was coming that they really needed to act then? And of course, over Christmas since then, we've seen all sorts of Epstein files being released in the US. Do you think this is going to overshadow the rest of 2026? What's your prediction?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on what else comes out, because as we know, there are hundreds of thousands of documents that haven't been released with regard to the Epstein files. So it depends very much on what comes out of the US on that front. I mean, it's not going to be forgotten. There was that release just before Christmas, which included, emails that Ghislaine Maxwell...
Pretty unsavoury emails.
Yeah.
I mean, the King will have hoped that, the action in October into November would have definitively sort of stemmed the flow of stuff around Andrew. But over Christmas, we saw, just in some of the release of the Epstein files, pretty horrendous stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, we should probably unpack some of the stuff that was released. There was 11,000 documents, but like you say, we now understand that to be maybe even 1% of what is yet to come.
There was an email exchange, wasn't there, between Ghislaine Maxwell, who's currently serving time in prison in New York she's been convicted of sex trafficking. Between her, we know she was a very good friend of Andrew's, and someone called A in emails. Of course, Andrew has always denied any wrongdoing. We must absolutely, continue to say that. But there was an exchange, an email exchange between them saying, "Have you found me any more inappropriate friends?" And then a reply from Ghislaine Maxwell. There was a signature of an A from Balmoral. We don't know definitively it was Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, but we believe he was at Balmoral at the time. Pretty unsavoury stuff. A photograph as well of him lying across the laps of 5 women at Sandringham. It just it kept it all going, doesn't it?
It felt like for the first time that there was more to it as well. That we saw correspondence, didn't we, between Ghislaine Maxwell and a contact in Peru where he was about to go in 2002, in which she seemed to be procuring intelligent, pretty and fun women from good families for this invisible man.
There is no suggestion of any illegal activity on the Peru trip.
Yeah, well, whoever A was in these emails, it was pretty grotesque what she seemed to be asking for. So, I think Charles did do his best to kind of cauterize this when he saw to it that Andrew lost, well, initially the dukedom and the Knight's Garter, I think, but then eventually he had his prince title rescinded before.
Yeah, at the end of October, he had that prince title.
Exactly.
And that was from the king himself. And interestingly, as we've talked about on the podcast before, I know Roya's mentioned it, is the king then actually saying that they had the utmost sympathy for the victims of Epstein, which something obviously Andrew had not said prior to that.
Yeah. Well, Charles comes across as a very empathetic man. As I say, I think he did his best to cauterize the situation.
He did, but the Andrew problem rolls on.
Well, that's the thing, because it's not in Charles's control. Yeah. It's not in the control of the royal family, this story. And the key problem, if coming back to the question about how it might unfold over the course of next year, it will, I think, depend largely on what else comes out, notwithstanding the fact that what we've seen already is highly suspicious and pretty grotesque.
You've hit the nail on the head. The royal family are not in control of this story.
Yeah.
The king can take as drastic action as he likes, like removing all the titles, which was massively drastic, but they're not in control of it. Apparently we're told only 1% of the Epstein files have been released.
That's right. So who knows what else is going to come out? And whatever does come out, even though Andrew has now been sort of siphoned off to wherever he's going to live on the Sandringham estate. The point is that photograph, for instance, that was taken, anyone who's watched the King's speech will recognise that room as where the young Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth spent Christmas with George V. And yet here's Andrew sort of draped across the laps of, I don't know, half a dozen anonymous women, and then you've got the emails as well. So the point about that is all of that allegedly happened when Andrew was a fully paid up working member of the royal family, not in the last sort of couple of years where he's been sort of gently pushed to one side.
The question now is, do those pictures which put out Epstein and all of that at the heart of the royal family, does that have a material impact on the monarchy as it stands?
Well, I think if it comes to light that there were people within the royal family itself or within the household who knew what Andrew was alleged to have been up to, then that will have a very damaging effect.
There are question marks over that, aren't there?
Yeah.
When he's going on official overseas tours, and we know because we travel with them all the time, there is an entourage, there are private secretaries, there are press secretaries. There is absolutely no suggestion that those private secretaries or press secretaries knew exactly what was going on. But those questions will keep being asked.
Yeah, quite rightly. Yeah.
Because it's difficult for a member of the royal family to, I suppose, go on those trips, do all that stuff without anyone, without any questions being asked.
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting in the Epstein files, you can see it all being released in the States, but it does bring the story back here to the UK. We've now got Surrey police saying they're going to look to international agencies to find out about some of the allegations. So it does bring the question as to whether, UK police forces will start talking to the FBI, whether the FBI have more of a remit to speak to Andrew on some of these matters, and problem trundles on.
I think it's highly unlikely that we won't see more material that raises questions about Andrew's conduct, because it's if you think about it, it's quite helpful for the US to be able to push this story towards our shores and keep it away from their own.
The Buckingham Palace there was no official response to any of the latest stuff that came out over the Christmas period from the Epstein files, but there was a very interestingly timed interview which the Queen gave to BBC's Radio 4 Today programme. Of course, it was pre-recorded before all this came out, but the subject matter was fascinating. Camilla was talking to John Hunt and his daughter Amy. John Hunt, the racing commentator, his wife and two of his daughters were brutally murdered. And Camilla, during the course of that very, very poignant conversation, very difficult conversation about, the most extreme form of domestic violence and violence in a relationship, talked about her own experience of a sexual assault when she was young. One of the things we have talked a lot about on the podcast is the very fact that Camilla, obviously a long-standing campaigner on this issue, she has done a lot for many years on it. So does the Duchess of Edinburgh. And that has become increasingly not tricky, but, the friction between that and what we have seen come out of the Epstein files and with Andrew's conduct has been marked. So the timing of this was really interesting.
It was one of the worst things that we heard about, I think, over the last couple of years, that crime. I really, really like Camilla. I think empathetically and intellectually, she's almost the exact opposite of Andrew. And she showed that when she sat down with John Hunt. And it would have been quite easy for someone who was less emotionally deft, if you like, to have used it as a way to get their own story out again, because we knew a bit about what had happened to Camilla because it was revealed in Valentine Lowe's book that we serialised in the Times and the Sunday Times.
We had him on the podcast talking about it.
Okay, yes. So we knew about that.
So this was the fact that she was attacked on a train as a teenager, and fought off essentially a sex assault.
Yeah.
But this was the first time she'd actually spoken about it herself.
Yeah, exactly. And she so we got the chance to hear her speak about it personally, but she didn't let it overshadow John Hunt's story, the story of what had happened to his family. And she recognises, as you say, Roy, she has been campaigning on this issue for a long time. But she recognises that it's not an issue that has gone away. If anything, it's gone in the opposite direction. It's a societal problem, violence against women and girls. And it's important for someone in her position to use what she referred to, I think, as a tiny soapbox to campaign against it. And that's what I felt she was doing in that interview, but in a very, very sympathetic way, which allowed John Hunt to speak very personally and movingly about what he had been through, and about how he still talks to his wife and daughters. I thought the whole thing was superbly done, very naturally done. And it just left me in awe of Camilla, actually.
I always think she'd be quite a good journalist, actually, because when we do see her sitting down with people, they do open up to her.
She's a good listener.
She is a good listener. She gives them chance to talk.
Yeah.
And she asks really insightful questions, and she's really interested.
I'm old enough to remember her coming into the Times newsroom once, about 15 years or so ago, when we were in a different building. And she performed very well in news conferences, very interested in the story. She came in, sat down, had a cup of tea and saw what we did for the day. I agree with you. She would make a good journalist.
She did. I was on a rival newspaper then, Jeremy. Imagine that. And I remember her coming into the newsroom then and talking, actually being introduced to her for the first time. And she's also very good at flattering people when she wants to, because she said, so how long have you been doing this brief? And I said, quite a few, a number of years. And she said, you must have started in the cradle. And I thought, very clever, Camilla.
She didn't say that to me.
But she's been quite bold, hasn't she, with the domestic violence remit?
Very.
I think, some of the stuff she's been sitting down with rape victims. She's now told us about her own experience. She said that it kind of lurked at the back of her brain. She'd almost tried to forget about it, but these things, as these things do. So she's got a really good understanding of it, but she hasn't shied away from what, could be quite a thorny subject.
No,
it's not natural territory for a queen historically.
It's not.
But she's made it natural territory for a queen now.
Yeah, she has. You're right. It's not the sort of area you necessarily expect the Queen to go into, but it has personal resonance for her because she was a victim of assault at an early age. Notwithstanding that, it feels to me as though it's a subject that she would have become involved with anyway. I think it's a great service that she's doing to women and girls in this country by continuing to campaign on that front.
So you can imagine, I think, behind the scenes, the fury that she must feel at the way in which, the Andrew story is overshadowing the good work, not necessarily just of what she's doing, but her husband, the king, and his legacy and his reign. That must be a source of extreme frustration, which is why they've probably, she's probably supported the king in that. Why she's supported him in that way.
I'm sure that's the case, because knowing as we do that she feels so strongly about this issue, how could she possibly identify with someone who is alleged to have done the things that Andrew has done? And you can see it by not just the physical distance, but the emotional distance that's being put between the senior members of the royal family and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Now, you don't just see it with the King and Queen, you see it, of course, well, you two know much better than I do, with the Prince and Princess of Wales as well. These are campaigning royals who, whether or not you actually agree with them on all the subjects that they're campaigning on, they are acting, they think, in the public interest. And certainly with Camilla, you can't argue that's not the case. So, why would she have any understanding or any empathy with Andrew over what's happened over the last few months and years?
So I suppose it's sort of onwards and upwards for the royal family. Let's look ahead to what is the emerging picture for the royals in the coming year. There's also a thorny subject of royal finances, of course, which are going to come under intense scrutiny. The Public Accounts Committee into the Crown Estate will reveal this year more about the property deals between the royal family and the Crown Estate. Follows, obviously, Times revelations about the fact that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor paid a peppercorn rent for years, 2 decades, on the Royal Lodge.
Andrew paid a £1 million premium plus £7.5 million upfront for refurbing and agreed to pay a peppercorn rent if demanded.
He'll be moving out this year to Sandringham, we're told. And then, it's a bit of a can of worms, isn't it, Jeremy, about what we might uncover.
Yeah, I think
it's not just going to stop at Andrew, is it?
No, this was another thing that happened towards the latter end of last year, because obviously there's been discussion about the royal finances for many years, and arrangements have been changed. They were changed when the coalition government was in place all those years ago as to how the royal family was funded. But we saw a big reaction when we published that story about Andrew paying a peppercorn rent at Royal Lodge. So much so, actually, that then I thought, well, why don't we just try and find out what's happening with some of these other grace and favour homes as well? So then a few weeks later, we found out that Edward and Sophie, two very well-respected royals, actually, have a sort of similar arrangement in place for Bagshot as well. And I think people are rightly, going to ask questions about why, people of their status are able to pay such small sums of money to stay in such, palatial homes. That's just one aspect.
I think we should add that like Andrew, Sophie and Edward did pay a lump sum, didn't they, up front?
Yeah, they did.
Bagshot.
In 2007, Edward's company paid £5 million up front for a 150-year lease, and the ongoing rent is peppercorn.
But you're right, they have a very fair, there's a big dispute over whether it's commercial rent they pay every year, but over Bagshot. And even though they're working royals, the Public Accounts Committee, as you say, not just anyone's going to, government, not government, but Parliament is now going to ask questions about that arrangement and others.
That's right. And that's completely fair. But that's just one aspect of the whole royal finance discussion. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert on the ins and outs of it at all, but I think that hair is now running, and there will be probably greater public scrutiny of the way the royals are funded and the fairness of those arrangements over the next few months than there ever has been.
I think one of the things we should look ahead to as well, I mean, we've talked about the Epstein files, you mentioned it's interesting, perhaps some of that, there's been a heads up to try and shift attention away from what's happened in America with the Epstein files. But we are going to have a lot of royal engagement with Trump in America this year, because it's been widely reported that the king is looking at making a state visit to America in the spring. And Kate wrote a piece over Christmas that, as well as that, we could see William go during the World Cup. We know he's president of the FA. We know he loves his football. The World Cup is in America and Mexico and Canada. There's a big anniversary of independence this year. So we might have a two-pronged pincer approach by the royal family, reciprocating that incredibly lavish welcome we saw laid out for President Trump and Melania when they came here. Why do we think that's important for us to be doing? Why are we possibly sending a double header over to America?
Well, I just think that, we know that Trump responds to that kind of approach, don't we? And so if our relationship with the United States, i.e. the relationship between our government and the US administration, is important to us, which clearly it is, then it's quite a good use of what the state has to offer to send Charles and other senior members of the Royals over there to I don't know, keep stroking Trump's ego as much as anything else. I think I don't particularly have a problem with that. I think if it's beneficial to us, then that's the sort of thing you actually do expect your head of state to do.
Well, you know that he would love to have dinner with the king, much more than he would with Sir Keir Starmer, for example. So it's a kind of a ploy that Starmer can use,
Exactly.
isn't it? In all those sort of diplomatic conversations he's having.
Send our royals to stroke Trump's ego.
Well, that's basically what's happening, isn't it? I mean,
it's probably not the job description that they, but it's the job description that they're, to be honest, that they are fully across because they know it's part of what they do.
they're totally across it, and
We saw them do it last year.
Of course, exactly. We had the state visit last year, and I think Charles accepts that and understands it. Now, what Charles makes personally of Trump.
Who can say?
Yeah, exactly. I will sit here and scratch my chin for the rest of the day over that.
But this year is interesting more than any, isn't it? Because it's the 250th anniversary of independence. The Queen late Queen went over 50 years ago to mark the 200th anniversary.
Yeah.
This is a point at which Trump on his own soil can say, we defeated the British. It'll be an interesting visit.
I have no doubt that he will dig Charles in the ribs, quite literally, if he gets the chance to do that. It is really interesting. It's also interesting because in other discussions we've seen what Trump has done in Venezuela over the course of the past week. There've been this ongoing row about what he might do with regards to Greenland, Canada. That question over Canada still keeps rearing its.
Charles went to Canada
Of course,
for a
yes.
day.
Charles is the king of Canada.
To speak in Parliament, to open Parliament, to basically a shot across the bows of Trump.
So
What effect does it have for Trump? That's the thing, I wonder. Does Trump go, that's all very nice, and then he gets on to business and thinks,
sure he does.
Britain can do what it likes. Does it really have an impact?
I think in the short term it does. I mean, he was very complimentary about Britain, obviously, during that period when he was over here and shortly afterwards. Well, it was shortly afterwards. I mean, he hasn't been so complimentary. I mean, he's not singled Britain out over the last few days, but he's not been particularly complimentary about, for instance, Europe over the last few days, in which he probably still sees Britain as part.
It's interesting. I think you've just made a really interesting point. There is a limit to how much impact the royal family has with Trump, because it's clear he loves spending time with them and he loves the sort of sheen that rubs off on him when he's around them. Also, he thinks with the images that project back in the States. But he has been rumbling on still about Canada. He has been making noises about Canada. People, still talking. He's still talking about that issue. I think Trump gets loads out of it. I think there's a bit of a question mark over what we get out of it.
Well, that was sort of what I was driving at, really. I think it's interesting, if he's making big claims about Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, which is a European ally of Great Britain, what power can the king have to say? Certainly the king's influence hasn't been seen when it comes to green issues on any Trump policies.
No.
So
I don't think the king will have any influence over the discussions with regards to Greenland at all, because, as you say, it's not. No. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It's not. Britain doesn't really have anything to do with it, other than as an ally of Denmark. If the conversation were to progress once more to the future of Canada and what the US might like to make of that, well, then
we might see some more royal visits.
We might well do that. We might well do. I do think that the benefits of these visits are probably quite short-lived. They're not going to affect Trump's foreign policy, at all.
No, of course
what they might do is they might win us some more favourable terms with regards to tariffs and things like that. They might do.
Well, this is where the government comes in, isn't it? Because the king can do his bit, William can do his bit, and they feel like they're doing their job and seem to be doing it very well. But is Starmer really leveraging the royal family in the right way? Like Roya says, are we really getting our bang for our buck when it comes to these things? That's a question for the politicians, surely, to make sure that if they're rolling out members of the royal family,
the crown,
with seemingly, really positive effect, surely they should be getting something in return. Behind the scenes, those conversations have to be taking place.
I think that's very fair. We have to have something tangible in return, basically, if we're going to go and prostrate ourselves in front of the president.
Speaking of America and the royals in America, we have royals in America already. Of course, we have the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, firmly ensconced in California for the past 6 years now, coming up to 6 years since they left, which we've hit. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, is going to be in the news a lot over the next few weeks because he's going to return to the UK within the next week, as soon as within the next week, for the final big trial against the tabloid press, against Associated Newspapers Limited. He, Elton John, Baroness Lawrence, Elizabeth Hurley, and several others, of course, with claims which ANL strenuously denies about historic phone hacking, unlawful information gathering. It's going to make a lot of headlines. It's another issue for the royal family that's sort of a rogue issue that they have no control over, really, because Harry is no longer within the working royal fold. How do you see that playing out?
Well, as you say, I think the rest of the royal family would rather it wasn't happening.
It's going to make uncomfortable viewing, isn't it?
It's going to make really uncomfortable viewing. And in terms of the court case, well, let's see how that plays out. But I mean, what experience I have of stories regarding Harry is that, wherever he goes, trouble or controversy tends to trail in quite short order afterwards. So, without being unfair to him, because he hasn't got here yet, I'd be surprised if it was a straightforward visit.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, he always begs the question every time he comes over, will he meet the king? He came over to the UK in September for a few days and was able to have something of a reunion with Charles. They had a 50-minute meeting over tea at Clarence House. It seemed at the time to be the start of a rekindling of the father-son relationship. And shortly afterwards, it seemed to unravel. Certainly in the press, there was a report in the Sun paper saying that Harry had given Charles a framed photograph of his family. Now, the Montecito reaction was that must have been leaked by somebody at the palace who was intent on sabotaging, that was their word, that relationship between father and son. The palace then completely, held their hands up saying, goodness, we're baffled and bemused by this. This is not true. And they felt slighted, having, made the effort to make that meeting happen. So very shortly after that, we understand this time there will be no meeting. Well, I've been told there's no plans for any meeting between Harry and the King, who's most likely to be in Scotland, and certainly doesn't want to get drawn into any active court proceedings.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to be seen to be linked to that. And certainly a meeting with Harry would then link the King to those proceedings. So that's not going to happen. It's still the question about his security. So what do you think Harry is still fighting for? Does he want to, is it just a kind of railing against the press? Is it that he wants his family? Does he really want a reunion with his family? What, from your perspective of reading into
like
it?
All of the above, doesn't it?
I think so. I mean, he's certainly railing against the press. I think he'd love, to have some sort of reunion with his family, but he's kind of already said that can't really happen on under current terms. And I think, this narrative will haunt his every visit until such time as that whole thing is put to bed, because he has a father who has been, suffering from cancer, as far as we know, for at least the last couple of years, been undergoing treatment. And it's well known that there's no love lost now between him and his brother and sister-in-law.
We're not even asking if if Harry's going to make time to see William. That question is
finished.
Yeah, people don't even query that anymore.
Exactly. So it's a family tragedy being played out very much in the public eye. So every time he comes back over to the UK, until such time as some of those issues are put to bed, that will be the story that's written about.
Well, I'm sure we will talk about Harry a lot more in the coming weeks as we see him on these shores, and we'll see how that trial plays out. All of which brings us to the point of, what does the monarchy look like in terms of how things are going to play out in 2026? We've talked about at the Andrew problem, we've talked about the Harry issue. Things are, those are two sort of bumps in the road that are never going to be particularly smooth for the royal family, possibly more uncomfortable questions about royal finances. But there are some good, positive things to look forward to, aren't there? And Kate and I have just been seeing images and pictures and words come through from the Prince and Princess of Wales, who've surprised NHS workers today at Charing Cross Hospital. We've had William talking about, how important it is to recognise people that work for the NHS. He used to work for East Anglia Ambulance. He talked about Catherine's own health journey. She was talking to someone who volunteers in the chemotherapy department. they are, if not sort of the great future hope of the royal family, certainly the mood music around them is more positive, I think, than some other elements that we've been talking about. Kate, you recently did a long read for the Times magazine about Kate, the other Kate, Catherine, looking ahead, looking about sort of her key areas of focus with people around her, people that she's worked with, talking about what kind of woman she is now, what kind of queen she might be. Tell us a little bit more about what you found out.
Well, it's interesting because I think now's the time to start asking questions about what kind of queen she will be. And that's no disrespect to the current queen, and it's no indication or reading the runes on, Charles's condition. But I think, looking ahead and palace always plan, I think it's important to ask those questions. She's now the most popular member of the royal family according to the latest YouGov poll. I mean, her and William are right at the top.
Do look at those polls.
They do, like politicians they do. They have to have the public support, even though they don't need the votes. They need the public support ultimately behind them. It's really interesting, actually, because a lot of people were quite open and able to tell me what happened. And the main takeaway, I thought, was that after her cancer treatment and everything she's been through, it's been a chance for her to kind of reassess, take a breath, and look at what she wants to do. And actually, she is really ambitious for the future. She is really ambitious for her early years project, which, a lot of people said it's not just about helping little kids. It's about, helping adults and those big societal changes. But the cancer treatment, as anybody who's been through it will probably say, has had a massive impact on her outlook and what she wants to achieve and what she does. But it's actually, she's quite an enigma, really. There's not really much we know about her in the public. She's followed the late Queen in that respect, in that she has maintained a lot of privacy. She's done it quite well. And it's interesting, apparently she loses her phone around the house quite a lot. And,
Most of us.
And there are elements of humanity that you can, she wants to see her kids do well. She's worried about, Prince George going up to secondary school, and she does not want him to be a lonely boy in the way that then Prince Charles, now the king, was a lonely child. And he said it himself in an interview in 1969, when he was interviewed when he turned 21. He did not, he spoke about his childhood being lonely because he was put on a pedestal by his peers, even by his teachers. And that isn't the model that Kate and William
thankfully,
want.
they've given them a very different upbringing to that.
Yeah, completely different era. I think she's getting involved in lots of the right areas. Clearly, they're very close to her heart, and obviously all of them, I think, are informed by her experiences, either through her illness or through being a parent of young children. But I think that's really important because what she can do, she's very accessible. Even though I agree with you, she is enigmatic, and I sometimes sit there and think I can't remember what Catherine's voice sounds like, because she doesn't speak publicly very often.
Not
does
very
she?
often, no. She did her first public speech in 2 years the other day.
Yeah, exactly.
A few weeks ago.
But she's you feel that she's accessible, and she can take matters of either public policy or perhaps things that policy can't quite reach, and she can bring them into people's homes and into their lives in a way that politicians can't.
So there's a lot to look forward to in 2026, and we'll be keeping a keen eye on it.
We will.
Our thanks to Jeremy Griffin for joining us this week.
And if 2025 was monumental for the royal family, it looks like 2026 is shaping up to be just as significant.
There's plenty coming up. And as always, we'll be keeping a close eye on how the royal story develops in the months ahead.
So don't forget to follow us, leave us a rating or review, or join the conversation whether you're watching or listening.
And as always, thanks for joining us on The Royals. See you next week.